All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this evening. I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Pat Kane, Public Programs and Visitor Services Coordinator at the Museum of the Grand Prairie and Champaign County Forest Preserve District. And again, thank you all so much for joining us tonight as we kick off a special speaker series where in just a few short moments, I will bring on Dr. Leslie Regan to present tonight's program, Responding to Polio. Before we do get into tonight's program, I just wanted to go over a few other items. On screen with us now is Rose Payne-Pinto. Rose will be interpreting tonight's program in American Sign Language, and I want to thank Rose so much for being with us tonight. For those of you who don't know anything about the Museum of the Grand Prairie or the Champaign County Forest Preserve District, the Museum of the Grand Prairie opened in 1968 as the early American museum. Our current mission is to collect, preserve, and interpret the cultural natural history of Champaign County and East Central Illinois for all generations. We're an accredited institution with the American Alliance of Museums and a part of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. Champaign County Forest Preserve District is a collection of 7 forest preserves, also including 2 educational facilities, which includes our museum and the Homer Lake Interpretive Center, includes golf course, Kickapoo Rail Trail, and so much more. In fulfillment of our district's mission to protect Champaign County's natural and cultural resources and inspire people to care for, enjoy, and explore their natural world, the Champaign County Forest Preserve District recognizes its responsibility to acknowledge those Native peoples who came before us on this land. We currently work to preserve and tell the story of the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Wea, Miami, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi nations. Native Americans shaped the landscape that the Forest Preserve District and Museum sits within. We must recognize that the forest preserves occupy the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the peoples previously mentioned, and that they were the first stewards of the land. It's necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations, to work with them, and to continue to steward the land and educate the public with honor and respect. CCFPD and the Museum of the Grand Prairie will work to be inclusive of all differences and keep Native peoples and their history at the core of our efforts. Also, I wanted to mention that this program, again, is the first in a special speaker series of virtual programs. This series will include virtual programs over the next several months, with this being the first one. All programs are tied to themes and elements present in our newest special exhibit, A History of Healing, Infectious Diseases and Community Responses to Defeat Them, which opened last month in late May. The exhibit focuses on the local and worldwide impact of such diseases as the 1918 flu, smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, polio, typhoid, cholera, HIV, AIDS, and COVID-19. In addition to examining the impact disease has had on our health and well-being, the exhibit also highlights particular instances in the past, as well as the present, where local citizens came together during previous epidemics and pandemics for the betterment of their communities. We encourage all to come visit this special exhibit at our museum, where our current summer hours have us being open Monday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and on Sundays from 1 to 5 p.m. And as always, admission to our museum is free. Also, I did want to let you know about a few other programs coming up in the series. On Thursday, July 28th, retired botanist and plant ecologist with the Illinois Natural History Survey, Bill Handel, will present the program titled Medicinal Plants and Uses by Indigenous Peoples of the Great Plains. So that program will be on Thursday, July 28th, again, on our Museum of the Grand Prairie Facebook and YouTube pages at 7 o'clock Central Standard Time. On Tuesday, August 23rd, Dr. Natalie Lira will present the program titled They Never Ask You, They Just Tell You After It's Done, Sterilization, Abuse, and Histories of Resistance. Again, Dr. Natalie Lira, Assistant Professor of Latina and Latino Studies at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, will present that program on Tuesday, August 23rd at 7 o'clock live on our Facebook and YouTube pages. Also, always like to see where folks are tuning in from during our virtual programs. So let us know where you're watching from by writing your location down in the comments section below. Have a few folks doing that already. Barb tuning in from Champaign. Hey, Barb. And Susan tuning in from Northern Michigan. So let us know where you're watching from by jotting that down in the comments section below. Also, should you have any questions during the course of tonight's program, also write those down in the comments section. We'll be moderating that throughout the evening. So write your comments, your questions down in the comments section on Facebook and YouTube. Lastly, tonight's program and the special speaker series is sponsored in part by our friends at Illinois Humanities. I'd like to thank Illinois Humanities for supporting our virtual speaker series. We really enjoy working with such great organizations like Illinois Humanities and are happy to work together to provide these virtual opportunities for our community. You can learn more about us at Museum of the Grand Prairie and Champaign County Forest Preserve District by finding us on social media or visiting museumofthegrandprairie.org or ccfpd.org. All right, with that, let's jump into tonight's program and bring on our presenter for this evening, Leslie. Leslie, can you see me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Hi,
It's
Leslie.
great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Very much looking forward to your presentation this evening. So I'm going to introduce you, Leslie, and then I will turn the show over to you. So Dr. Leslie J Regan is professor of history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she has affiliations in the departments of gender and women's studies, media studies, and the College of Law. Her PhD is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she studied in both the history department and the history of medicine program in the UW College of Medicine. Dr. Regan is the author of When Abortion Was a Crime, Women, Medicine, and Law in the United States from 1867 to 1973, which won the Willard Hurst Book Award, among others, and is the go-to book on the century when abortion was illegal. A second edition with a new update will be available soon. She is also the author of Dangerous Pregnancies, Mothers, Disabilities, and Abortion in Modern America, which investigates the German measles or rubella epidemic of the early 1960s and the role the disease and disabilities played in early abortion law reform. Dangerous Pregnancies has been honored with major book awards from the American Public Health Association, the American Historical Association, the American Association for the History of Medicine, and the American Anthropological Association. Professor Regan is also the co-editor with Nancy Tomez and Paula Treichler of Medicine's Moving Pictures, Medicine, Bodies, and Health in American Film and Television, which includes Regan's chapter of breast cancer self-examination films. She is currently completing a book on the history of the health effects of Agent Orange in the United States and Vietnam. Recent scholarly publications include Traveling for Abortion in International History, which was published in the Journal of Modern European History, and My Daughter Was Genetically Drafted with Me, U.S. Vietnam War Veterans, Disabilities and Gender, which was published in the journal Gender and History. Dr. Regan has received numerous grants from the National Institutes of Health, National Library of Medicine, National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, the American Bar Foundation, Rockefeller, ACOG Ortho, the Schlesinger Library, and other institutions. She appears frequently on National Public Radio, various podcasts, including The Ezra Klein Show, and has written for the Washington Post, Slate, Ms. Magazine, and other local and national publications. Lastly, Leslie is on the steering committee of her local ACLU chapter. So without further ado, I'd like to give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Leslie J. Regan. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. All right, Leslie, I think you're muted. Leslie, I believe you're muted.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. And also, we're only seeing, we're just seeing the full PowerPoint window there.
How about
now? We are not seeing full
screen. Dear. Okay. I think we have to start over again.
Yeah, let's stop share and then reshare.
I'm really sorry.
No, that's okay. No worries.
I thought I had turned the mic back on. All right. Share screen. Oh, so the problem. Okay. I remember now. I've got to have it. No, I can't.
If you're able to share your entire screen, Leslie.
Share screen. Okay. And it's going to ask me to pick. And I'm going to allow it. And you see everything right now, right?
Yes.
And now do you see just the slide?
We do not. We just see.
Jeez.
Leslie,
okay.
if you can.
I'm really sorry.
No, that's okay. No worries. If you can stop sharing your screen, and then when you click share, there's an option to share your entire screen. Let's select that. And then if you click on the screen with an entire screen, it should allow you to.
Okay. Okay. Yes, I see entire screen. And
then click on the box and then click on the box that looks like your screen.
allow.
Looks like us. Okay. And then if you go to your PowerPoint, I'm seeing your screen now, but it's not up in public view. But if you go to your PowerPoint, go full slide.
Can you see that now?
Yes, we are. Yep, you're good to go.
Good, excellent.
All right, we made it. We're good.
Okay. So, hello.
There we go.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for introducing me and for inviting me. I'm really thrilled that the museum has done an exhibit on infectious diseases. When I teach on the history of disease, I ask, what's your favorite disease? Maybe some people in the audience have favorite diseases. If you're not used to that, it might seem funny, but they're all very interesting for learning about people's experiences and also about society. And we did practice getting my PowerPoints up 2 or 3 times already, but nonetheless, we had a tech fail. Sorry to the audience. So I want to talk about the social responses to polio and disability today. And I've put up here 4 images that I am betting most of you are familiar with, or at least some of them. They are really the iconic images of polio in the United States. First, in the left-hand corner, President Franklin D. Roosevelt sitting in a wheelchair with a dog on his lap and a little girl next to him. So he clearly uses a wheelchair. But we'll talk more about this because it's a very rare image. The second photo of the iron lung, both a symbol of technology and medical advances, as well as a symbol of terror and what frightened the public, and a symbol too of the success of the movement to provide for and pay for the care of people with polio. Bottom back to the left, going direction of reading, the poster child here for the March of Dimes, being used to broadcast what polio is, infantile paralysis as it was called then, and encouraging people to donate. And these were all posters that they put out every year with a child. And then this final image of the children happily standing in line, the polio pioneers who are about to, I'm guessing, get a shot because they are all grinning. And certainly after an injection, they would probably not be. But anyhow, all very, very proud to be participants in the polio trial, which eventually this is how we've all become vaccinated against polio and have eliminated it in the US as an infectious disease. So President Roosevelt, we can see that he uses a wheelchair in this image. This was not an image that was in the public view while he was president. There are only 2 pictures that they know of of him using a wheelchair. Instead, what the public saw was a picture like this, all the photos of President Roosevelt on the campaign trail or as president. This is a 1944 picture. He stands, he walks to the podium. He stands when he gives speeches. He is always presented as not needing a wheelchair, not needing assistance, strong. He has overcome the disease. He can stand and walk. And I realize I should back up a second here because I've begun with the assumption that we all know what polio is. You might be chatting saying, you need to tell me that. And so it's known it's a virus that causes paralysis, but initially appears as a fever, as kind of like a cold or a flu. And people don't necessarily know they have it, and it can't really diagnose it. And the main thing that makes it diagnosable is paralysis. And for some people, that might just be in one limb, or it might be temporary. For some people, it was more extensive. And so there was a major epidemic in 1916 and FDR caught it in 1921. He was an adult. And he becomes sort of, in many ways, and then the poster children, the face of what polio is and the way it is remembered today. But you can see, of course, he was from a very well-to-do, almost aristocratic family in the U.S., and so he did not fit the profile of who got polio. It was considered this disease of people who lived in dirty tenements in cities, immigrants, and they were sort of blamed for their disease because, they were filthy and dirty. They let their children play in the streets, and thus, that's why there was an epidemic among them. But what obviously he showed, and then what continued to happen, was it was actually people who were in extremely sanitary environments who were the ones who also got polio. And that's part of the interest in it, is the way it was not confined to a community that was defined as diseased already. And there might be concern, but probably not on the same level. President Roosevelt, when he had polio, he also discovered warm springs where he could get water treatments and swimming, and there were other polios there. By the time he becomes president, he wants to separate obviously he's presenting one thing as always appearing to be completely able-bodied. No photos were ever allowed of him being helped, being carried, being assisted as he walked, using a cane. Photos were not allowed. And the press went along with that. His sons helped him walk up to podiums. So it looked like he was walking, but they were actually helping him to move. So it's a very deliberate strategy. At the same time, the American public knew that he had polio, but implicitly it appeared that he had overcome the disease and that he was cured and he was not, quote unquote, crippled. And I'm using those air quotes here. Those were the terms used at the time. And the disease, polio, was called the Crippler. That was an alternative name for it, was the Crippler. And there were films, you can watch documentaries that show these movies about the Crippler will come and get you and get your children. And that was used really all the time. It was used as a taunt for children, for adults. It was used to describe people simply as a description. And of course was part of the discrimination and difficulty for people with disabilities getting jobs. And as Daniel Wilson, a historian and polio himself, remarked after he did his research on polios, was that word cripple could really hurt people. It was very common, but it was also something that was very painful. So FDR he bought Warm Springs, and he separates his kind of work on that, and they create a national organization, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, to provide treatments and pay for the treatments of people who contracted polio, and pay for them to go to Warm Springs, cover their care, and also began to do research that ultimately led to the vaccine. So this is the one of the kinds of things that the National Foundation, otherwise known as the March of Dimes, paid for. They paid when there was an epidemic. They brought in iron lungs. They brought in nurses and doctors, people who were very familiar with the disease and the treatments. And so this is an image of scientific advancement and technology and the way it could provide a cure. But it was really also an image that was always used and seen as evidence of a tragedy and very fearful. It's part of the fear that people had for polio and why they wanted to give money to eradicate the disease. And there was also a source, polio's, many spent some time or a long time in an iron lung, which would breathe for them if they had a paralysis in the diaphragm. And they kind of have a mixed feeling. It's a tool that saved their lives. It was also, of course, identified them in a certain way. They were also very frightening to them to be immobilized in the iron lung. And sometimes nurses could be mean and tell them, if you don't shape up, I'm not going to come in and, nurses and caretakers had to clean them, provide food. They were entirely dependent that way. And there are stories of, a nurse who said, look, if you don't behave, I'll turn it off, which of course is a threat of murder. And that was a child. So there are a lot of painful and traumatic memories associated with the treatments for polio. At the same time, there's also memories of this was what saved them. They were there for a few days or a few weeks or months. Some people lived in them for decades. And then they were eventually weaned off and they were able to breathe on their own. And they remember those awful stories, but they also remember, Daniel Wilson talks about sort of a music in the room of at nighttime when people were trying to sleep and there was no one else there, you would just hear the breathing of the machines. And they weren't all exactly the same. And there was sort of this nighttime music. So this is the poster, the March of Dimes poster. And what I wanted to especially look at is this phrase, look, I can walk again. And so what they emphasize in this image and in so many others is that they will be cured. They will not be, quote unquote, confined to a wheelchair. They will be able to walk. And there is such an emphasis on walking. The wheelchair itself is clearly extremely stigmatized. And some people did, but some people are using crutches. They're using all kinds of things, but they really emphasize with your dimes, with your money, with our research, children, your children, the children you're afraid of who might catch polio will be able to walk and will be normal again. Now, historian Naomi Rogers, who's done a lot of work on history on polio, has studied Warm Springs and polios, and she argues, correctly, I think, that this campaign by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis to emphasize children and poster children was part of a concerted effort to eliminate the emerging sort of movement of polios for disability rights, because there was a movement organized of polios that was and other people with disabilities who were talking about the poor treatment that they were receiving in rehabilitation centers, about the stigmatization, making demands for respect and jobs. And the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis notably never took up any of those issues. It was not that no one had thought of them, but they did not want to take up those issues, and they wanted to define it very narrowly as medical, as cure, and increasingly for children, and prevention, that we're going to do everything we can to try to prevent the creation of quote unquote cripples. This is another poster, and you see here that this is a African-American boy who is representing polio and what polio is like and what you need to fear. Most of these posters were of white children. They were directed at the entire community, but obviously speaking primarily to white people about their innocent children and their fears of disease, of crippling, and of death. There's African Americans complained about this. There's an African American who worked with the March of Dimes and fought for these kinds of posters to be directed at African American communities so that they would see themselves in the materials and would be educated about polio. And of course, they would also be encouraged to donate money. But this way, they would also know that the March of Dimes, the National Foundation, existed and was prepared to help provide medical care and treatment and pay for it. And then, after the vaccine trials, prevention. So to help with the campaign. There was quite a critique of this, the National Foundation and Warm Springs around racial segregation. So this is an image of Warm Springs. And as you can see here, everyone's dressed up. They're having a grand time. It's a party. They had dances. And this was part of what made Warm Springs really a special place for the polios who were able to go there, even if it was for a short visit. Not only did they receive treatments and physical therapy, but they were with other polios. They were in a community of polios, so people like them who used wheelchairs or crutches or, sometimes crawled because of stairs. And they all understood that the place was designed for them. They paid a lot of attention to the constructions of the buildings so that it was accessible. They had parties. They played games. They got physical therapy in the pool, but they also played in the pool. They had romances and dating. And it was really very meaningful for people. You will probably also note that everyone in this picture is white in their dresses and their finery. Although actually in the very far back, there are several African Americans dressed in white uniforms who served as maids, cooks, cleaners, people who carried people if needed. And so this was Warm Springs was a spa that FDR had gone to in hopes that it would cure him. And what he found was community and fun. And he also thought it helped him. And he eventually bought it and turned it into a place for polios. But it was in Georgia, which was segregated. That was the law. And like other national organizations composed of whites, they did not challenge the racial segregation of Warm Springs. And during his presidency, FDR was being criticized by the African American community who supported him and said, he was starting to have criticism of the racism and the racial segregation in Warm Springs. So they responded and they started funding treatment, making that more accessible to African Americans. However, they did not integrate Warm Springs. What they did was they funded Tuskegee as a place where African Americans with polio could go for treatment and care. And that was a Southern school, and that was the only place that they had to travel long distances if they didn't live right nearby. This is also from the Warm Springs, the Polio Chronicle, and playing polio, as it says, a 1933 cartoon. And this cartoon, it's such a great cartoon. It is playful, it's having fun, and it is quite the opposite of the public representation of polio and people's fears and beliefs about the disease. Because the representation is, of course, it's deadly, it's paralyzing. People who have polio were victims, they were tragic. You might have pity for them, but the disease was dreaded and you did not want yourself or your child to be like them. And what this shows is that polios are having fun, they play, they're physically active and strong. And of course that has gendered importance of men being able to play polo or men who use wheelchairs in the Veterans Administration created wheelchair basketball. So very, very different image internally. And these were the people who were on their own in the 1920s and 30s. They had a newspaper and were developing their own, were making demands. But with the power of the presidency and the money that celebrities and ordinary people were donating to the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, they do not have that kind of public presence or power, and disappeared in terms of memory and political power. So that really is the first kind of, or one of the first early movements of people with disabilities for their rights, is this movement in the 20s and 30s. It's not the first, there are others, by Polios. The second one begins with the World War II GI Bill, and it eventually comes to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And this was veterans, men who had been wounded but survived, which in the past they would not have survived these injuries. And they said, we should be able to get an education too. And the VA, under pressure from veterans organizations, created a school at Galesburg, the University of Illinois at Galesburg. We don't have a school named at Galesburg anymore. It was temporary. It started in 1948, and they were going to college there. And then the governor decided that it had been a hospital. It was seen as perfect for students who used wheelchairs, because it was already designed to be accessible to wheelchairs, to rolling hospital beds. So it worked perfectly. It was completely flat. It didn't have stairs. It had ramps. And then the governor decided he wanted to use that for something else, and he was going to take it away to, I forget what it was going to turn into, but I think a nursing home. And the wheelchair students, as they were called, protested. They went to the Capitol. They protested in their wheelchairs. They had veterans supporting them and demanding that they keep the school open. Now, that didn't, it's moving itself. That didn't succeed. And eventually, under a lot of pressure from the students themselves and from veterans groups, they convinced the University of Illinois to allow those 15 GIs to come to the University of Illinois at Urbana. And their original thought was, we'll take these students and then we're done. They never intended it for it to be a permanent program, and they were very reluctant about having them come to the campus. There were professors who objected because they're not smart enough. Why are they here? You're letting them in. They're not, are they going to be able to do their work? A lot of automatic doubt about students with disabilities. Now, although the university did not intend for this program to last, that is not what the students who used wheelchairs thought, or the head of the program, Tim Nugent. They always intended to bring in more students and continue to fight administrators and trustees as needed to get resources and also to stay on campus. So it begins with veterans, but very quickly, I believe the first year that they came to Urbana, there was a local family who inquired about their daughter who was a polio and used a wheelchair. And they saw this as this opportunity. And so polio, people with polios and who were not all veterans, also joined the program and went to the university. They had their own program that they went through. And this group ends up being so important that the veterans themselves insisted on being in the university. When they couldn't get the university to make curb cuts so that they could get around, they went and they would only make curb cuts if the curb was already broken. And so the students, some of the students, along with the administrator of the program, Tim Nugent, went out and took some sledgehammers one night and started breaking curbs so that the university would be forced to repair them and put in curb cuts. So this was a very activist administrator who was really clearly an ally of the people with disabilities who were students here, and was not afraid to take on anyone who tried to stop them or who did not want to provide an equal education to students with disabilities. There's a lot more I could say about this entire program and him, but it is important to know that this started at the University of Illinois. You can see here, he's talking to the basketball team. This was also very important to show that they were independent. They pushed their own wheelchairs. They took care of themselves in their own homes. They did not need help. That they were physically capable and played sports just like normal guys. I'm using normal in quotes the way it was used there. And they were successful in academics, and they were successful in getting good jobs. This was always part of how they presented themselves and also how they gained support from the local community, from veterans, from families, from politicians, and managed to keep this program here, which is now huge at the University of Illinois and serves thousands of students, not just students using wheelchairs, but thousands of students with various disabilities, some physical, many invisible. This program, the University of Illinois, and the way that it brought wheelchair users together, and they were in a special program of their own, and they supported each other, and they had their own parties and things while they were also going to school like every other college student. This became a place where people learned about people with disabilities as a community and about the need to fight for their rights and their obligation to do that on behalf of everybody who is disabled. They spent a lot of time on accessibility to buildings. The earliest requirements for building accessibility came from Illinois, and this image on the bottom is part of their research into ramps and at what level it's supposed to be at so that people can use them. So the University of Illinois, special education schools where children were segregated, blind, deaf, into separate schools, and rather than integrated with all children, but were always been put into separate special schools and camps for the handicapped, as they were called, all became very important for producing community, a sense of self and independence, and nurturing what became the disability rights movement of the 60s and 70s. If you haven't seen Crip Camp, I highly suggest that you do. It shows this in the camps. And this is an image from the 70s of, and all of these movements have leaders who are polios. They learned from FDR's example and the expectation that as a polio, you would have to be independent, you would have to be strong and do it with a smile and without complaining, and that you would have to develop your mind and get education in order to get good jobs. So they also they're like heroes, and they sort of adopt that perspective of themselves and showed it in leadership of this movement, blocking buses because they had stairs and they didn't have any way to get in, blocking buildings and doing crawl-ins at buildings because there were only stairs, and the fight for the 504, which mandated public education for all, quote, all handicapped children. That's what these are from. So I don't know, in terms of time, I wanted to talk about the social model versus the medical model. I'll just try to be really fast so we have questions. But this comes out of, people earlier were trying to address this, but this idea and this language comes from the 70s, this movement. And you could see the way we were talking about polio and people's fears of it, that they see the problem as, oh, these are out of order now. They see the problem as the disabled person. The problem is the disease. The problem is the person is confined to a wheelchair. They can't walk. They can't see or hear. They're housebound. And they need to be cured. And this is called the medical model because of the expectation that medicine would cure and fix people, whether it's through surgery or various treatments. But that's what people look to medicine for. That's what society looked to medicine for. They would fix them and turn them into normal people, which we could see in those posters, right? We'll work and we'll fix you so that you do not have to use a wheelchair. And the critique that the people with disabilities came up with is, it's not us. It's not us that are the problem. The problem is the society and the country, the disabling world. Disabled people in the past and present have higher unemployment rates, lower income, higher poverty, and that's discrimination. It's not because of the diseases and disabilities or the shapes of their bodies. The things that we were just showing that polio's led the way on, the buildings with stairs. Buildings don't have to have stairs, but they have all been built that way. And that can change. Pushing people into special schools, isolating families because of disability within the family. And another thing about FDR and this issue about stairs versus ramps, when he was president, they of course had to figure out how to make it, how to accommodate him and how he could move around. They put ramps in on the government buildings, the agencies in DC, so that he could get around, and that was great for other people who were also disabled and other people who used wheelchairs, because now they could get around too. When he passed and FDR was no longer there as president, they removed all the ramps. It's astonishing. It really shows it as, this is a problem of one person that we'll take care of and will fix only temporarily. Not today because of the struggles of the past and the passage of laws and the ADA, we do have ramps, and that accessibility is better, but of course there's a long ways to go. So this brings us to that idea of the medical model, and that the National Foundation embraced and really represents of, it provided treatment, but it wanted to end polio and end the problem with a vaccine. Not opposed to the vaccine, but they put all their energies there. And this was something that, polio's objected to the way they were used as an image, and stigmatized in order to, and pitied in order to raise funds for scientific research and a vaccine. And once the vaccine became available and was widely used, they no longer were supporting the polios, people with polio. And some of them really felt like all the money that they received should go to supporting polios and should not have gone into other things. So this is an internal battle. So this image, I had learned, probably many of us, looks like, we've beat polio. There were some mistakes were made. People did get polio again, but by the 1970s, we've pretty much gotten rid of polio in the U.S. And it looks like total success in the U.S. And by the 1970s, scientists and doctors were like, what? Infectious disease? They're not interested. What a boring field. A lot of stuff in public health was shut down. They were really not interested. Only backwards thinking people went into infectious diseases. That really was the thought. And then HIV appeared in the 1980s, and it's like, oh, infectious diseases are actually really interesting and really, really important. But there was this idea that we had conquered the infectious diseases that had been so deadly, and infant mortality had gone way down, child mortality had gone down, in part because of vaccines, also nutrition and other reasons, and everything was good. But that was only looking at the United States by itself and Europe. In fact, polio can still existed, along with cholera and other diseases that are seemingly gone, but they're only gone from the rich countries. And this is just to show you that, of course, as you probably know, that there's an effort to eradicate polio worldwide. And an image of, again, a child, a Black child, to invoke interest, pity, money, and also to encourage, of course, children around the world, their parents and their communities and their political leaders to vaccinate. Polio has not disappeared. You may have seen that there are several cases in the UK right now that they just found. But this map shows you where it is. It's an endemic in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Mozambique, and then you can see that there are several countries in Africa where there are polio cases. So it's not gone. I'll just throw this up here for you just to, this is about polio, but it's such an important part of disability history, just to put major events in disability history. The Civil War pensions, first for disabled veterans of the Union. VA hospitals were built for World War veterans. The movement of the 20s and 30s of polios that I mentioned. The GI Bill, which led to higher education for disabled veterans, known as wheelchair students. Social Security, disability insurance in 1956. The protests in Berkeley and New York around stairs and curbs that I was showing you pictures of. Education for all handicapped children in 1973, now known as IDEA. Americans disabled for accessible public transport. There's a deaf student strike in Gallaudet in 1988, which was important for bringing attention to deaf students and to also building the larger movement. And then finally in 1990, Americans with Disabilities Act. That's not the end of disability history by any means. There is a vivid, I'm seeing if I can come back to you and turn this off. Let's see if I can figure that out. I will stop the screen.
Yes.
Thank you for all being here. But polio is a painful disease. It came back with people who polios were so trained to succeed, to not notice their disability, to push forward. And then in later adulthood, many found they had what is now known as post-polio syndrome, that they began to experience neurological effects and all. And by then, the experts in polio no longer were around in terms of doctors. The experts are the polios. But they really had all thought it was gone, that they were cured. So anyway, I'm curious. I don't know what you've been putting in chat, if anything. I'm happy to hear your memories and thoughts. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. Really appreciate the presentation, and we had some folks chiming in the chat. And if anybody out there has any questions or additional comments, again, you can put those down below. But during the course of the program, we had various folks, chime in here. Barb mentioning that the disease she finds the most interesting is tuberculosis. Susan also saying, there at the beginning when we were having. We eventually got it up on the screen, sharing the screen. She said, "Don't worry, this is worth the wait." So that's good. But Susan and Barb also sharing that, they had some close personal relationships with individuals who they knew that had polio, that were close to them, growing up, and that sort of thing. So if you have questions, additional comments, as I mentioned, put those down into the chat. I had one question just to start off. Leslie, looking at the history of responses to polio, and as of course, as you mentioned there at the end, the world is still responding to polio because it's not completely gone, in the world. Anything you think from in responding to polio, anything from that campaign successes and failures that you think could be applied to our current COVID-19 pandemic? Anything that we can learn from or pick up on that could be applied to our current situation?
That's a good question. There are downsides to the March of Dimes, which I think I was bringing out, but they're also developed, it wasn't the only organization. There was an organization for tuberculosis. There's the American Cancer Society that had started and now is very large. There were a lot of voluntary organizations around healthcare that did sort of mobilize a sense of community, and that we need to do this for the entire community. We need to vaccinate, or we need to be a part of the trial. But I think it always was a mix of, this is good for you and your own child and family and neighborhood, and that larger community. It has always been with the history of disease that in epidemics, the social divides come out very clearly and are deepened, and people are blamed for the disease. So, the period that we're talking here about, the mid-20th century, polio is identified with middle-class white people and their families. And so I think that is part of, but they're not only middle class, really, because there are, working people and farmers and extremely poor people who get polio and who write letters to FDR. But the images tell you that they are white people. They're middle class. They have jobs. They go to church. And the people they recruited to and who appear in the pictures in the films. So, anyone who's not white was used to having to deal with that in society and finding their way to getting things and translating that information for their own families and their own use. So I don't know if that doesn't answer your question of what we could use from this, but certainly the sense that these are community responsibilities is really important for dealing with any kind of public health problem, all public health problems, that they're really not just your family or yours alone. It is the entire community that suffers together or can have a better life together.
Certainly. I was seeing Rose as a friend down there. No, thank you, Leslie. E Porter 2004, and also chiming in from YouTube. You mentioned post-polio syndrome there at the end. She said her mom had it for the last 20 years of her life. So
yeah. Did she get care that she thought was good? Oh, I don't know if that person's still here.
Hopefully they still are, and they could respond, in the comments there. Barb had a question here. Interested in the use of the term polios to refer to people who have contracted polio. Is that a term used within the community?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. You have it exactly right. And that's why I was using it, is people who had polio and the people who were together in hospitals, because people were instantly hospitalized and who went to Warm Springs, they called themselves polios, the shorthand. So they named themselves polios. So it is using the in language of the people with polio, the people with disabilities themselves, rather than the cripples and the Crippler, which was standard language. They named themselves polios.
Susan asking, with the current fight against polio, still going on. Do you know anything about current vaccination campaigns in third world countries?
Yeah, I mean, you could see that the Rotary Club and Gates Foundation, I mean, gives a lot of money to do this, and they've been, had the goal of eradicating the disease around the world through vaccination. Eradication is extremely difficult. There's debate among public health professionals and scholars and international people about whether this is actually a worthwhile goal, activity and a way to spend money. I mean, even everything we've been talking about, polio got a lot of attention and a lot of money and, raised money. It was not a disease that was the most widespread or the most deadly. There were more people who were affected and dying from tuberculosis at the time than polio. But polio was much more dramatic because some people were paralyzed and because it was an epidemic, whereas tuberculosis was just an endemic. It's part of the thing that we always have. And it wasn't made into something. I mean, they tried, but it just didn't have the same level of fear or cachet in terms of who got it. So the eradication efforts, yes, they've been doing vaccines around the world, and I mentioned Afghanistan and Pakistan and a couple other countries are the only ones where it's endemic, and it has run into issues because it's a priority that comes from outside, and where they've had problems is the people coming in are from outside and offering injections or the oral vaccine to infants, and sometimes in some countries they have so many people coming in, missionaries, capitalists, traders, and people who do research on them. There's plenty of pharmaceutical and scientific research in the third world, and where they've had problems is sometimes people not trusting and thinking, you're giving something to kill our children. And so there's a lot of cultural work that has to be done, and that really, and I can't answer because I haven't looked at the whole thing about whether this should be a priority, but it is a priority because people are funding it. So it is a priority, and WHO has taken it up as an international priority.
Maybe got time for a few more questions. One question I had, Leslie, if people are interested in learning more, not only about history of polio responses, in the United States or internationally, or you told some great stories there of accessibility activism, especially there on on the U of I campus. I love the story of the students going out and taking the sledgehammers to the curb. But if folks are interested in learning more about, these issues, even if there's local people interested in learning more about, wheelchair students at the University of Illinois, do you have any like book recommendations or journals or documentaries or archives, other sources you'd recommend people take a look at to learn more, about these issues?
Yeah. So everything from, there's a huge collection from the students who who have been in the, well, it's now called DRES, right? In the the program for wheelchair students at the university. There's a huge collection held in the archives. A lot of it is digitized with oral histories, interviews, the magazines and newspapers that were produced by students. There's all kinds of records, and a lot of it is digitized and available so that anybody can go in and see it. And they also have lots of photographs and film and scrapbooks from students. So I've looked at some of that. I wrote a little bit on the program that's in a book, University of Innovation. I can't remember the title. That's edited by Fred Hoxie. Others, I would say that movie, there's Naomi Rogers has written a couple of books on polio that are excellent. I would recommend those. And you can also go online. So I'm saying that the archives or DRES at the University of Illinois, they do have histories and images online. If you just go to those websites, you could search Tim Nugent or DRES and history, and you'll find it.
I'm gonna have to check those out, after this as well. I'm interested in learning more.
Yeah, it's great. It's really important. It's a real achievement.
It really is, yeah, and to see that local university, as a leader, in accessibility, is nice to see as well. Well, I think that brings us to the end here. I'm not seeing too many more questions or comments. Do have some folks, saying thank you. Thanks for the presentation from E. Porter. Thanks for your education of us, Susan says. And then she says she also has to take off. Must leave, but see you in a month for our next program in the series.
Thank you, Barbara.
And then Barb putting in the title of the book you just mentioned.
Thank you. That is it. It's actually a great book, but it's all the different innovations at the university, all kinds of, and they're short essays. But thanks so much to you, Pat and Rose, and to the audience for coming.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Rose, for providing our ASL interpretation for this evening. Thank you to everybody who watched this live, maybe watching it recorded as well. Really appreciate you guys tuning in, and hope to see you at future programs within the series. But for everyone here, until next time, everybody enjoy the rest of your evening.